He accused me of stealing on the very morning we were meant to bury our grandmother. His words were loud enough to stop the whispering prayers in the hallway. I stood there in black, holding a folded piece of paper she had left for me, and in that moment I knew the funeral would not start until I spoke. My name is Claire Dalton. I'm 32 years old. People often say I have a calmness about me, a stillness that makes it hard to read my emotions. I suppose that's true. I've never been one for shouting or tearing at others when I'm hurt. I hold my anger like a stone in my pocket, quiet, heavy, unshakable. That morning, standing in front of my brother Matthew and a handful of relatives who already looked at me with suspicion, I understood what kind of day it would be. Not a farewell, but a reckoning. Matthew's accusation didn't come out of nowhere. Our family has long been divided by money, by jealousy, by a hunger for recognition that never seemed to fade no matter how much anyone already had. But stealing? That word sliced through the air like a blade. He said it without hesitation, with eyes that burned and hands that trembled, as if exposing me was his duty. He wanted them to look at me differently. He wanted me branded before the ground even closed over her coffin. I didn't answer him right away. The silence made him restless, and I let it stretch. My grandmother once told me that silence is more powerful than noise when you need people to pay attention. So I folded the paper back into my purse and watched his chest rise and fall too quickly. My cousin stared between us, unsure which of us was telling the truth, or maybe just waiting for a fight. But I wasn't going to give him the spectacle he wanted. Not yet. Inside me, though, something shifted. I had been preparing for this moment, even if I didn't want to admit it. For weeks, I had seen the way Matthew rifled through drawers, the way he whispered to our aunt in the kitchen when he thought I couldn't hear. I knew he was searching for what I had. But what I held that morning was not money, not jewelry, not anything they could sell or divide. It was a letter in her handwriting. Words meant for me alone. Words that explained why she trusted me, why she left certain matters in my hands. That, to them, was worse than any stolen coin. It was proof that she chose me, and not them. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I said only, "This isn't the time or the place, Matthew." He barked out a bitter laugh, as if I had proven his point. But I saw the flicker of fear behind his eyes. He expected me to falter, to defend myself with frantic words. Instead, I gave him nothing he could twist. Just composure. Just control. That's when I realized something important. He was more afraid of me than I was of him. The pastor cleared his throat, shuffling his notes, trying to bring the room back to order. People adjusted their coats and avoided eye contact. My mother looked at me with that weary expression she often wore, as though I had brought this on myself by existing outside the mold she wanted. And still, the weight of the folded letter pressed against my side, reminding me that this story wasn't finished. It had only just begun. As we walked into the chapel, I felt the distance between myself and the rest of them stretch wider than the aisle. Every step was heavy with their unspoken judgments, their simmering resentment. I could almost hear it buzzing behind me, thief, liar, selfish girl. Yet none of them knew the truth. None of them knew the promises I had made to her in those final days. None of them knew how carefully I had listened when she whispered what she wanted carried forward. The casket lay at the front, flowers arranged too perfectly around it. I kept my eyes on the wood, remembering the softness of her hands, the way she smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The ache in my chest was sharp, but under it burned something harder. Resolve. If they wanted to turn this into a war, I was ready to fight, even if my weapons were nothing more than patience and the truth. When the service began, I felt Matthew's gaze cut into me from across the row. He was waiting for me to crack. But I stayed still, breathing in the scent of lilies, listening to the pastor's words that seemed to skim over the surface of grief without touching its depth. I thought of the letter. I thought of her voice telling me not to let them destroy what mattered. And I thought of the storm I was about to walk into once the prayers ended. I knew then that delaying the funeral, forcing them to hear me before the burial, wouldn't just be an act of defiance. It would be my first step in protecting what she left in my care. It would be the line none of them expected me to draw. The moment when Quiet Claire stopped being invisible. The final hymn began, voices shaky, uncertain. My hands tightened together in my lap, and I looked up, already planning what I would say when I stood. They thought I would stay silent forever. But they were wrong. Because when the last note faded, I would rise, and the first words out of my mouth would change the course of everything that followed. The hymn ended, and silence settled like dust in the air. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Every eye waited, expecting me to bow my head and let the service move on. Instead, I stood. The scrape of the wooden pew startled the row behind me. I didn't look at them. My gaze fixed on the casket, the polished wood reflecting soft light from the stained glass above. My voice came slowly, measured, as though I were speaking directly to her and not to the restless crowd. I said only that before we laid her to rest, there were words of hers that needed to be heard. I reached into my purse and withdrew the folded letter. My fingers traced the crease as though her hand might still be there guiding mine. A wave of whispers swept through the room. Matthew shifted in his seat, restless. He wanted to shout again, to accuse, but he bit down on his lip when I raised the paper. This wasn't noise anymore. This was her voice. The letter was short, just a page in her tight, slanting script, but it carried the weight of her truth. She spoke of legacy, not money. She wrote about honesty, about trust, about her wish that one person would carry her values forward without compromise. She wrote my name. She wrote it clearly. My voice didn't shake as I read. Each word fell into the space like a stone dropped into water, spreading ripples through the faces turned toward me. No names of who she distrusted, no list of grievances. Just her simple belief in me. When I reached the last line, I folded the paper again and pressed it to my chest. Silence stretched, heavier this time. It wasn't reverence. It was calculation. I could feel them trying to measure what this meant, what it gave me, what it denied them. I sat down, and the pastor cleared his throat, stumbling back into the prayer. The service limped forward, but nothing felt the same. When the casket was carried out and the pallbearers moved down the aisle, I walked behind them alone. No one offered me an arm. No one looked me in the eye. At the graveside, the wind tugged at the black cloth draped over the canopy. I stood close enough to smell the damp soil piled to the side, the sharp tang of cut grass. I whispered goodbye under my breath, words meant only for her. My throat ached, but no tears came. I felt them watching me, waiting for some collapse. I gave them none. Later, at the house, the mood shifted from grief to greed. Plates of food lined the kitchen counter, untouched. Cups of coffee cooled on side tables. Conversations clustered in corners, voices low but urgent. They thought I couldn't hear, but I've always listened better in silence. Words like unfair, challenging, and lawyer floated through the air. Matthew cornered me near the dining room, his voice clipped and sharp. He said, "You had no right to do that. You embarrassed this family." I replied, I honored her request. That was my only concern. His jaw tightened. He wanted to strike, but not with fists. His weapons were subtler, rumors, influence, threats whispered where no one could hear my answers. I saw it in his eyes, this wasn't finished. As the evening stretched, I slipped away from the noise into her old study. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets. Books lined the shelves, some leaning against each other like tired companions. I sat at her desk, running my fingers over the worn wood, and let myself remember. She had been the only one who spoke to me without judgment. She never measured me against Matthew's successes or my mother's endless expectations. She taught me patience when I was restless, courage when I was afraid. I could still hear her voice in the way she recited small poems as she poured tea, or the way she tapped her knuckles on the table when making a point. One memory rose sharper than the rest. I was 12, and Matthew had stolen money from my mother's purse. When she found it missing, he pointed at me without hesitation. I didn't defend myself, I froze, ashamed by the weight of her disappointment. But my grandmother stepped in, quiet and steady. She said, "A lie reveals itself if you let it breathe long enough." Days later, the truth slipped from his mouth, and he avoided me for weeks. I never forgot the way she looked at me then, not as a victim, but as someone stronger for having endured the silence. Now, in the stillness of her study, I understood why she left her words with me. She trusted that I would not waste them in anger. She believed I would know when to act and when to wait. That knowledge pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. From the living room, laughter burst suddenly, jagged and wrong for the occasion. I recognized my aunt's shrill voice, weaving through the crowd, recounting stories about inheritance disputes in other families. They were preparing their case not in court, but in whispers. I closed the desk drawer and stood. My reflection in the study window startled me, my eyes harder than I remembered, my shoulders squared. It struck me that grief and resolve were shaping me into someone new. When I stepped back into the hallway, Matthew was already watching me from across the room, his hand clenched around a glass. He gave me a smile that wasn't a smile at all. I returned nothing. The silence between us was louder than any words. As the night thinned, I left without goodbyes. The letter rested in my bag, a quiet weight against my hip. The street outside was dark, lined with cars parked too close together. I unlocked mine, slid into the driver's seat, and gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. I knew they would come for me. Not with fists, but with papers, with claims, with demands that would twist her intentions into something ugly. I knew this was only the beginning. And as the engine turned over, I whispered to myself, I won't let them take her from me. The headlights cut through the night, but the road ahead was uncertain. Somewhere inside, though, I felt the stirrings of a plan. It was still faint, still unformed. But it was there, quiet, waiting. And I knew the next time they tried to corner me, I would not simply endure. I drove on, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine, and wondered how far Matthew would go to strip me of what she gave. And how far I was willing to go to stop him. Grief is quiet, but greed never is. By the third day, the call started, sharp, clipped, and perfectly rehearsed. The first one came just before noon. I was standing at the kitchen counter, spooning sugar into lukewarm tea, when the name lit up my phone. Eleanor Parker, Matthew's attorney. Or rather, his new attorney. A name I hadn't heard in years, but one my grandmother used to say with a grim twist of the mouth. I let the call go to voicemail, my hand tightening around the mug. I didn't need to hear it to know what it meant. Matthew was moving quickly, faster than grief allowed, faster than decency permitted. He wanted to stake a claim before the dust had even settled. He didn't care what her letter said. He would try to rewrite it with signatures and seals and the weight of our family's silence. I didn't answer the next two calls either. One from my uncle, who hadn't spoken to me since I moved back to care for her, the other from a cousin I barely knew, who was suddenly worried about the estate. I imagined them gathered at Matthew's kitchen table, papers spread out, voices low and urgent. Not mourning, not remembering her, but plotting. For years, I had watched them circle her like wolves. They masked it as care, but I saw how they flinched at her boundaries, how they bristled when she didn't bend. She was a woman who left nothing vague. Her values were iron-spined and inconvenient. And now that she was gone, they believed they could soften her edges. Redefine her legacy. I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but because silence was strategy. Noise would only give them traction. And I needed to understand exactly what I was facing before I made a single move. The weight of the responsibility pressed harder with each day. I hadn't expected it to feel so personal. This wasn't about money. It was about voice. About whose story would be heard. By the end of the week, I began noticing strange shifts, small, deliberate things. The password to her bank account no longer worked. A storage key she had always kept in the hallway drawer was missing. A file folder I'd tucked into the safe was gone. It wasn't paranoia. I knew the rhythms of her house, the quiet order she maintained. Someone had entered it, and they weren't looking for memories. I changed the locks without telling anyone. A locksmith named Daniel came out that afternoon. He was quiet, respectful, didn't ask questions. As he packed up his tools, he hesitated. He said, "You're not the first one I've worked with after a death. Families can be tricky." I replied, "It's not grief that makes them dangerous. It's opportunity." He gave a small nod and didn't push further. But after he left, I sat on the couch, hands pressed to my knees, and let myself admit something I hadn't said aloud. I felt alone. Deeply, unmistakably alone. I had friends, of course. But friends don't always know what to do with this kind of conflict. They say the wrong things, don't take it personally, or I'm sure it'll blow over. As if a legal challenge to my character could be brushed away like dust on a photo frame. There was one person, though. Ava. She and I had met through work, years ago. She had been the kind of colleague you keep in your corner, level-headed, fiercely loyal, unafraid to cut through noise. When I called her that night, I wasn't sure why. I just needed to hear a voice that wasn't rehearsing a threat. She listened without interrupting. No soft reassurances. No shallow advice. When I finished, she said only. She said, "Then you'll need someone to look over the documents. And someone who doesn't owe your brother anything." By the next morning, she had emailed me the name of a probate attorney, someone she trusted, someone outside the family's circle. I saved the name, but didn't make the call yet. Not because I doubted him, but because I wasn't ready to make the first move. Instead, I returned to the house. Her house. The one I had spent so many months caring for, protecting from dust and disrepair. I walked through the room slowly, letting memory speak. In the guest bedroom closet, high on the shelf behind a stack of faded towels, I found a small wooden box. It wasn't locked, just latched. Inside, neatly tied with ribbon, were letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to me. Some to Matthew. Others to names I hadn't heard in years. I didn't open mine right away. I sat with the box on my lap, staring out the window at the overgrown hedge she used to trim herself with kitchen scissors. I felt her presence then, not as a ghost, but as a kind of resistance. A quiet refusal to be erased. When I finally untied the ribbon, my hands shook. Her handwriting filled the page, familiar and looping. She spoke of things I had forgotten, our shared afternoons, her regrets about how the family had turned, her fears about what would happen once she was gone. But there was one line that stayed with me more than the rest: "You'll need to carry the truth quietly, but not invisibly." That night, I took her will out of the safe and read it again, every word, every clause. She had left the house to me, yes. But more than that, she named me as the executor. The one to carry out her intentions. The one she trusted to withstand the blowback. Matthew hadn't expected that. He had assumed I would inherit a portion, maybe a keepsake. But not power. Not authority. That's what enraged him most. Not what I was given, but what he was not. By the end of the second week, the formal letter arrived. Folded and creased with sterile precision. A request for mediation over the estate. No direct accusations, just concerns, confusion, fairness. The words were polished, but the threat was real. I made the call to Ava's attorney the next morning. His name was Grant. He sounded calm, maybe too calm. But I needed that. I sent over the documents, the will, the letter she had written, the box of envelopes. 2 days later, Grant called me back. He said, "There's no ambiguity. But that won't stop them from trying to create some." I replied, "Let them try. I have time." He paused, as if weighing whether I understood what that would mean. He said, "They're going to come at you from angles you're not prepared for. They'll push emotional buttons. Make it look like you're unstable. Or worse, like you're hiding something." I replied, "Then I'll need to be quieter than their noise." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about legacy, not just the house, not just the bank accounts, but the pattern she had tried to break by choosing me. Our family ran on hierarchy, on inheritance as leverage. She had given me something different, responsibility without permission to fail. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a new tension began to take shape, not fear of losing, but fear of becoming like them in the process. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one, "Hold me steady." Because I knew this wasn't just about defending what was hers. It was about defending what she meant. And that kind of fight would cost something I hadn't yet named. And I wasn't sure how much of myself I was willing to spend. The first letter was polite. The second was sharper. By the third, it was clear, they weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, each page heavy with the weight of someone else's intentions. The words mediation, redistribution, and family fairness repeated like a mantra designed to corner me. I traced my finger down the lines until the ink blurred. I could almost hear Matthew dictating the tone, calm on the surface, venom beneath. But I didn't crumble. I began to plan. Strategy had never been my first instinct in life. I used to be the one who trusted, who assumed others would act with decency if I did. That innocence had been chipped away long before this, but now it was gone entirely. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "Carry the truth quietly, but not invisibly." I started small. I catalogued every document, scanned copies of the will, her medical records, the notarized letter naming me executor. I photographed the wooden box of letters, each envelope tied in ribbon, and created digital backups that I stored in more than one place. Each action felt like building a wall brick by brick, not against grief, but against the storm coming. Then I went back to the house. Not to mourn, but to search. Her study became my command center. I pulled open drawers, flipped through ledgers, examined the faint pencil notes she left in the margins of books. Every scrap of paper mattered. I found utility bills from years past, handwritten lists of expenses, even grocery receipts carefully folded. She had kept everything, not out of obsession, but out of order. She must have known one day the records would matter. When I opened the lowest drawer of her desk, tucked behind a stack of worn files, I found something that made me pause. A slim black notebook, bound in leather, with her initials pressed into the corner. Inside, neat lines of her handwriting filled the pages, notes of conversations, dates of visits, reminders of things Matthew had asked of her. Money he had borrowed and never returned. Promises he had broken. Each entry was dated, factual, unembellished. It was not spite. It was evidence. I sat back in her chair, notebook in my lap, and let the air settle around me. She had known. She had anticipated this. And she had left me not only her voice in letters, but a record that cut through the lies before they could even be spoken. That night, I called Grant. I read a few lines aloud, my voice steady. He said, "Keep that close. Don't let anyone know you have it yet." I replied, "It changes everything, doesn't it?" He said, "It gives you leverage." Which is exactly what they'll never forgive. Leverage. The word felt foreign on my tongue, but it settled in me with a weight that was strangely grounding. I wasn't just holding on to her memory anymore. I was holding something that could shift the balance of power. Days passed, and the pressure grew louder. Another cousin reached out, pretending concern but circling back to sharing and family unity. I kept my answers clipped, polite. Silence still worked in my favor. But I could feel their frustration rising, their need to draw me into noise. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, I drove past Matthew's house. I hadn't meant to. My route home simply bent that way, and I let it happen. Through the front window, I saw them gathered, my mother, my aunt, Matthew leaning forward at the table, papers spread wide. I slowed the car, but didn't stop. Watching them scheme in the glow of domestic light, I realized something sharp: they believed I was still reacting. They hadn't yet understood I was preparing. Preparation became my discipline. I copied the black notebook by hand, page after page, until I knew every detail etched into my memory. I stored the original in a locked fireproof box. I gave a copy to Grant, another to Ava, sealed and unmarked. The thought of losing it made my chest tighten. It was more than evidence, it was my grandmother's way of protecting me, even now. At night, lying in bed, I thought about what it meant to fight without screaming, to resist without spectacle. Quiet revenge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about slamming doors or breaking ties in a blaze of fury. It was about standing, unmovable, until the other side realized they had built their walls on sand. Still, the loneliness pressed harder. I went through my days on edge, waiting for the next letter, the next call, the next subtle dig disguised as concern. My body carried the tension in ways I couldn't hide, jaw clenched, shoulders tight, sleep shallow. Even Ava noticed, her message is short but perceptive, don't let them eat your silence alive. One evening, I sat at my grandmother's old desk with the lamp casting a small circle of light. I placed the letter she had written to me beside the black notebook. Her words about truth, her careful record of his lies. Together, they painted a picture that was undeniable. And for the first time, I began to imagine what it would feel like to confront him with it. Not in whispers, not in avoidance, but face to face, with others watching. The thought was not satisfying. It was not triumph. It was something steadier, more dangerous, clarity. I closed the notebook, slid it into the drawer, and exhaled. The confrontation was coming. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm in the air before the first drop of rain. And I knew when it broke, nothing in our family would remain untouched. Confrontation has a sound. It isn't loud, it's the sudden stillness when no one dares to move. That was the air in the lawyer's office when I finally faced them. The conference table stretched long and polished, reflecting the weight of papers neatly stacked at each seat. Grant sat beside me, calm as ever, his presence quiet but grounding. Across from us, Matthew, my mother, my aunt. Their attorney, Eleanor Parker, adjusted her glasses with deliberate precision. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee gone stale. I sat with my hands folded, the black notebook heavy in my bag, though I hadn't placed it on the table. Not yet. Eleanor opened with pleasantries, but her tone carried an undercurrent of warning. Words like amicable, resolution, and family unity were deployed with surgical intent. I listened without interruption. My silence was deliberate, and I could see how much it unnerved Matthew. His knee bounced under the table, the rhythm betraying the calm mask he tried to wear. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. I laid out the facts, nothing more. The will was clear. The letter naming me executor was valid. My grandmother's wishes had been explicit, witnessed, notarized. Each word I spoke landed with weight, and I saw Eleanor's pen pause briefly over her notes. Matthew broke first. He said, she manipulated her. Everyone knows it. She's been living off her pity for years. I replied, if you had proof of that, we wouldn't be sitting here. His face reddened, and my mother's hand closed over his wrist, a warning to hold back. But the damage was already done. His accusation hung in the air, brittle and transparent. Grant shifted slightly beside me, his quiet confidence filling the silence I allowed to stretch. I reached into my bag and placed the black notebook on the table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The leather cover, the initials pressed into the corner, were enough to pull every eye toward it. My aunt inhaled sharply. Matthew froze, his legs stilled. I let them look, let their minds race with what it might contain. I said, she documented everything. Every promise, every debt, every lie. If you want to dispute her will, this comes with me into the courtroom. The words were steady, unshaken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence after was the sharpest weapon I had. Eleanor's eyes flicked to Matthew, a silent assessment of just how far he was willing to drag this. My mother shifted in her chair, her gaze fixed on the table as though she could will herself invisible. My aunt pursed her lips, the calculation in her expression barely concealed. Grant spoke then, his tone measured but firm. He said, "The will is unambiguous. If your clients continue to pursue this, we'll let the court decide. But understand, once this record is entered, it becomes public. Every entry, every word. That's not in anyone's interest." The word public landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples of fear crossed their faces. The thought of reputations unraveled, of whispers in church pews and boardrooms, was sharper than any financial loss. Matthew leaned forward, his voice lower, almost a growl. He said, "You think this makes you untouchable. But you've already made yourself the enemy. Don't forget that." I replied, "An enemy is made when someone chooses to attack. I've only defended what was given to me." His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with retreat. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped. No agreements were signed, but the shift was clear. They had come to intimidate me, to corner me with force. Instead, they left knowing I was not as malleable as they believed. When the door closed behind them, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled under the table, hidden from Grant's view. Strength was often a mask, and mine had held just long enough. Driving home that evening, the city blurred past in streaks of light. My mind replayed every glance, every pause, every tremor in their voices. I knew this wasn't over. People like Matthew didn't surrender, they regrouped. But something had shifted. They now understood that I wasn't alone, that I had evidence, that I could wield silence like a weapon sharper than their noise. At home, I placed the notebook back into its fireproof box and locked it. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, eyes tired but steady. I thought of her again, her lavender scent, her quiet laugh, her insistence that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and still it wins. I poured a glass of water, my hands finally still, and sat at the table in the silence of my small kitchen. The confrontation had left me drained, but underneath the exhaustion was something else, a seed of resolve that had taken root. Because I knew now, Matthew's threats weren't just about the estate. They were about control, about erasing her choice, about silencing me. And if he couldn't break me in that room, he would try somewhere else. I turned off the light, the house sinking into shadow, and carried the weight of what was coming into the quiet of my bedroom. For the first time, I let myself admit it, this fight would cost more than documents or inheritance. It would demand something deeper. And I wasn't sure yet how far I was willing to go. Some betrayals happen with a signature. Others with silence. This one came through a locked door left swinging open. The back door to my grandmother's house had been latched, double-checked before I left the day before. But when I pulled into the driveway that morning, the screen was askew and the wooden door behind it gaped just slightly. It wasn't wind. The latch was splintered, the wood bruised like someone had forced their way through it with a crowbar. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first. No drawers yanked open. No obvious mess. But I noticed small things. A paperweight moved. A picture frame off-center. A faint smear of soil on the floor, as if someone had stepped in from the garden path and wiped their shoes too late. I moved slowly from room to room, not out of fear, but calculation. Whoever had come wasn't looking to steal jewelry or art. They were searching for something else, something hidden. Something that could shift control back into their hands. The safe hadn't been touched. But the fireproof box that held the black notebook had been moved. Only slightly, but enough to tell me someone had tried, then stopped. Either they couldn't crack it or they panicked. Either way, they had been close. I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the blank television screen. My thoughts weren't racing. They were focused, cold. The break-in wasn't random. It was Matthew. Or someone he sent. And that meant he was out of moves. I called Grant first. Told him only what mattered. He said, "File a police report, but don't expect it to go anywhere." "These things rarely do." I replied, "I'm not filing it to win. I'm filing it to document the escalation." After the officer left with a clipboard of polite indifference, I changed the locks again. Not just the back door, but the windows too, every point of access sealed, reinforced. I installed a motion light over the garage, a camera near the porch. It wasn't paranoia. It was precaution. And yet, something in me shifted that night. I'd kept the fight legal, restrained. I had played by the rules, honored the paperwork, resisted retaliation. But now, something in his actions made clear, he didn't see me as an opponent. He saw me as an obstacle. One that needed to be removed, quietly, without mess. That knowledge settled over me not as fear, but resolve. If he wouldn't play fair, I'd stop playing at all. I spent the next 3 days creating backups of everything, on encrypted drives, in cloud folders labeled under unrelated names. The black notebook was scanned page by page and uploaded to a server Ava had access to. I sent her a printed copy in a sealed envelope, just in case. I also wrote a summary of everything. Not a legal brief, something simpler. A letter. To be read if anything happened to me. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't drama. It was realism. I didn't trust him to stop. And I didn't trust silence to protect me anymore unless it had witnesses. Ava agreed to hold the envelope. No questions asked. She didn't offer comforting words. She knew better. The following week, a new letter arrived from Eleanor's office. Thinner than the others. Just a single page. A notice of withdrawal. Matthew had dismissed her. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. It meant he was stepping out of the official channels and into something murkier. The next day, I received a call from a reporter. Local paper. Asking for comment about a contested estate matter involving the Dalton family. I said nothing and hung up. My stomach twisted. He was moving the battle into the court of opinion now, framing the narrative before I could stop it. But I could still control what mattered. I went back to the notebook. I studied the entries again. Dated, measured, deliberate. Some of them pointed to more than just unpaid debts or broken promises. They hinted at financial arrangements, loans, favors, names. People outside the family who might have something to lose if the wrong line ended up in court. Grant advised caution. He said, "That's power. But use it too early, and you lose it." I replied, "I don't want to use it. I want him to know I could." We scheduled a second meeting. No attorneys. Just him and me. Neutral location. A small private room at the library, of all places, public, quiet, surrounded by too much history to allow yelling. He arrived late, alone. No greeting. Just that clipped jaw and narrowed eyes. He sat across from me, posture stiff, breathing shallow. I laid nothing on the table. I showed no documents. I didn't need to. He already knew what I had. I said, "You've made your position clear. I want to make mine clear now." He stared, waiting. I said, "If you come near the house again, if I hear of another lie, another leak, another door forced, I will take every word of that notebook into a courtroom and read it out loud." His face didn't move, but I saw it, the twitch near his temple, the flicker of fear behind calculation. He said, "You don't want to go to war with me." I replied, "You're not a war. You're a noise I can outlast." That ended it. Not the fight, but the bluff. He stood, silent, and walked out without a backward glance. I stayed seated, not because I was tired, but because I wanted him to know I wasn't chasing him anymore. After he left, I sat in the quiet of the library for almost an hour. Just breathing. Watching dust drift in the beams of sunlight from the windows. That night, I opened the last letter my grandmother had written to me. One I hadn't dared to read until now. It wasn't long. Just 3 lines. When it gets loud, speak less. When it gets cruel, protect the quiet things. You are one of them. I folded it carefully and placed it inside the notebook. and for the first time I felt the fight might be nearly over. But then came the knock at the door. Not loud. Just 3 slow taps. Measured. Intentional. I didn't move at first. Just listened. And something in that silence told me, this wasn't Matthew. Not this time. The knock didn't come again. Just 3 slow taps, then nothing. The kind of silence that waits for you to open the door first. I stood in the hallway, barefoot, breath held in my chest. I hadn't turned on the porch light yet. The evening behind me was dim, the corners of the house drawn in shadow. Through the peephole, no figure, no movement. But I felt it, whoever had knocked was still there. Waiting. I didn't open the door. Instead, I spoke. Quiet, clear. I said, "Who is it?" A pause. Then, a man's voice replied, "I knew your grandmother. She wrote about me." His tone wasn't aggressive. If anything, it sounded tired. That was more alarming than anger. I flipped the lock but didn't turn the knob. My voice held. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Only to hand you something. Then I'll leave." I opened the door exactly 4 inches, enough to see his face. Middle-aged. Weathered. Suit, but not expensive. In his hand, a small envelope. No return address, no markings. He handed it through the gap. Didn't try to peer inside. Didn't offer a name. He said, "She told me you'd know when to read it." That was 5 years ago. I replied, "Why now?" He said, "Because she said the family would come for you when the house got quiet." Then he turned and walked away, down the steps, past the hedge, into the dark. I didn't follow. Back inside, I set the envelope on the table and stared at it. The air in the room felt heavier than before, like the walls were holding their breath with me. The kettle clicked off behind me, water forgotten. All I could hear was the clock over the stove ticking in the silence. I opened the envelope. Inside, a letter. Folded twice. Her handwriting. Smaller, more compressed than usual, like she'd been writing quickly. The paper smelled faintly of cedar. She started with a date, March 17th, 5 years ago. The day after I had flown back from a job interview in Portland. She had hugged me longer than usual that night, whispered something about legacy, but I hadn't understood then. Now I did. In the letter, she detailed a second account, one she hadn't included in the will. Held quietly, under a trust, with instructions to remain sealed unless certain conditions were met. Conditions which, she wrote, will become necessary only if they attempt to erase your place. My breath caught. She had known this fight was coming. Not just suspected, known. The account wasn't about wealth. It wasn't large. But it held something more powerful, documents. Originals. Legal records. Financial ledgers. A copy of a letter from Matthew himself, asking for funds he had denied ever requesting. Receipts from cash withdrawals she had made on his behalf. Letters from an accountant confirming irregular transfers. And a statement of her intent, that these documents were not to be used to punish, but to protect me. I stared at the last line. If they come for your voice, use mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I scanned every document. I photographed the envelope, her letter, everything inside. I sent copies to Grant, to Ava, and mailed another set to a safety deposit box I opened the next morning. The next family mediation meeting had already been scheduled. They didn't know I had this. They believed I'd gone quiet again. That I was retreating. But I didn't bring the documents to that meeting. I brought the silence. They talked, about compromise, about rebuilding trust, about settling out of court. Matthew offered a shallow apology, thin as tracing paper. My aunt mentioned reconciliation. My mother didn't speak at all. Her silence was not solidarity. It was avoidance. When it came to my turn, I didn't unseal anything. I didn't raise my voice. I said, I have everything I need. I won't use it unless I'm forced. But understand, this ends now. They didn't ask what I meant. They didn't have to. They felt it. For once, they didn't argue. By the following week, the case was quietly withdrawn. No apology. No letters. Just silence. The kind that finally meant something had shifted. I signed the paperwork with Grant in his office on a Thursday. Rain tapped against the windows, soft and steady. He didn't say much. Just nodded when it was done. I stood by the door for a long moment before leaving. He said, "You handled this the way most people can't." I replied, "I handled it the way she would have wanted." Back home, I opened the window in the study. The air smelled like damp earth. Somewhere outside, a sparrow chirped once, then fell quiet. I picked up the black notebook and placed it back in the drawer where I'd found it. I no longer needed to read the entries. I no longer needed to prove anything. Months passed. The house felt different now. Not haunted. Just honest. I donated her old coats. I kept the recipes written on stained index cards. I turned the study into a small reading room. No grand changes. Just breath. Just space. One morning in early spring, I stood on the porch and watched the light move across the hedges she used to trim with scissors. They'd grown wild. For the first time, I let them. The doorbell rang. I opened it without flinching. A woman stood there. Mid-40s. Nervous. A folder in her hand. She said her mother had known mine. That she had something of my grandmother's. That she hoped she wasn't intruding. I stepped aside. I said, "You're not. Come in." Because some stories don't end. They turn. They widen. They find new pages. And I was ready to read them.